Hello and welcome to our podcast, How to Stay Married So Far, and welcome if you're watching us on YouTube. I'd just like to add to this that we do unusually do our podcast from our home if you're listening. So you will sometimes hear a dog or a child will sometimes pass through, or even sometimes the postman knocks on the door. But what we do is we just keep on running because I think one of the really good things about our podcast is, if I may be so bold, is that we do not edit it at all. Whatever happens stays in, and
whatever happens in the podcast
stays in the podcast. And we really don't discuss very much at all what we're going to talk about. We kind of get an idea and then we just chuck it out there. And some podcasts, I think that's more evident than others.
Yeah.
But today's one, actually, if you're on YouTube or you're just joining us, please could you hit the subscribe and the notification bell, just because we love it when people do that. So for those of you that are new to the podcast, Mark and I have been a couple of times in our marriage to a marriage guidance counsellor. I actually wish now that we'd gone before we even got married. I think it would have been a great... Mind you, maybe we wouldn't have ended up getting married.
Yeah, I think we'd have run in opposite directions.
We would have been talked out of it, wouldn't
and also
we?
imagine the first thing a potential person says to you, let's go to counselling.
I suppose in the olden days, that's what used to happen when people get married in church, and they would go to the priest, but you had to have a certain amount of counselling sessions, didn't you? I think there's something in that. But anyway, so we believe in it, as do the Obamas.
It's like a psychoanalytically arranged marriage.
Yeah, and so do the Obamas. The Obamas have recently plugged in again to their marriage guiding counsellor. Yeah. And I think Mark and I, we've mentioned before on the podcast that we think it's probably time. There's been a lot of changes going on for us as a couple, as individuals, the world, everything. There seems to be more stress. The planet seems more fragile. We all feel more fragile. And so we have talked about finding a marriage guidance counsellor and plugging back in again. So we thought a good podcast would be to look into what are the reasons for approaching a marriage guidance counsellor.
How to know when you need a marriage counselling.
How to know. And there is actually a lot out there. I've got a bit of good news, actually. So I've been looking around on the internet. Guess what? Marriage rates supposedly are on the decline.
Right.
Which is great, isn't it? Well, it's often said...
Marriage is on the decline. Which is great.
No. But it's often said that 50% of first marriages end in divorce.
Right.
This is the good bit of news. But that number has remained unchanged for 30 years.
Right.
I would have thought that would have been an incline on that.
But effectively it has gone down because the number of marriages has declined.
Well, I'm just trying to give a bit of good news.
Well, I don't understand what the good news is in there.
Well, that we believe that it's getting worse and worse and worse, but actually it's not.
Well, you could argue that fewer and fewer people are seeing the point of getting married. So...
Okay, I tried, folks, but you see, Mark's good at numbers and I'm not.
No, it's just, that idea that you can read statistics in totally different ways.
Yeah, it's the cup half full, cup half empty, isn't it? God, that was just us
even before you said that, go back to what you just read out. You were already at the beginning defining
marriage rates on a decline.
So the cup is already smaller.
Well,
before you said, and then you said the cup's, basically you were saying the cup's much smaller, but it's more half full. Or it's the same half full. So if that's the cup that it used to be, and that's half, and that's the cup now, and that's half, it's gone down.
Yeah, but it's not getting any worse.
It is,
because
fewer people are getting married.
What a bugger that I have already said in this that we never say anything out, because now all that's going to go in and I'm going to sound like a right plonk.
So fewer people are staying married, basically. But it's the same number of those that get married.
Now, of course, divorce for many will often be
swift,
the healthiest choice, because some people are in very toxic or could be in dangerous relationships or whatever. That's set aside.
Oh, yeah. Or a danger to the children.
A danger to the children or whatever. That's set aside. We just want to look at the reasons that the professionals give. Because, again, we are not professionals. We're just sharing our experience, seeing if that helps anyone. So, number one reason for going to see a counsellor is when communication, and I'm reading this, has become negative. Once communication's deteriorated, it's often hard to get it going back in the right direction. That's so true.
Yeah, that's interesting.
That's so true.
Well, that's interesting because with a quick snapshot of our relationship, it would be easy to say that I approach everything negatively and you approach everything positively. I was reading something yesterday about the fact that there is negative positivity. And
oh God, here we go.
No, there is. And there's ways and means of sort of insisting on seeing the world that actually can add to stress, can add to fear, is sort of like a sort of verbal band-aid to just make oneself feel better about things in the short term now.
God,
but
I can do that. Thank God I can.
It
It
might work for you.
A whole lot better than people that
But all I'm saying is that it's never all one thing or all another. So yes, you could say that I look at things in a negative way in terms of communicating.
I would say that you don't look at stuff in a negative way.
No.
But
Often it's absolutely required to look at things honestly and unflinchingly, and not just in the worst case scenario, but in order to prepare. I'm a great one for, forewarned is forearmed. And it's easy to get shot down when you're a forewarner, forearmer, because you're having to face full on.
But you've got to be careful what you're saying here now, because you also have talked a lot about being a person that suffers from anxiety.
Oh, absolutely.
So anxious people, and we were having this conversation earlier on today, what they do is, people that suffer very badly with anxiety, is that they believe that if they're constantly thinking about the worst outcome, they are somehow prepared for it. Yeah. And there is somewhere in between that. So I do think, it's very valuable the way that you are, and you are a strategist, and I think that that's good, and thank God for it. Otherwise, God knows what state this family would be in. But you also self-harm by catastrophizing. But actually, we've gone off the point here.
Well, yeah,
we're not talking about we're talking about when communication becomes negative as a reason to go and see a counsellor.
So
that would be something like, oh well, blah 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 blah. That tone, that we get into, and all couples do. Well, I would have thought that you would have da-da-da when everything is on the downbeat.
Yeah, and I think the reason
And sometimes that you can get into such cycle, and neither you might go into your separate areas of the house and think, oh God, why are we just talking to each other like this? How do we get off this track? And I think that that's what they're talking about.
Yeah, and I think the problem with that,
really
I think the reason that spirals, and when I think back to counselling, and I wish we could employ it a bit more sometimes, is that generally, even if two people in a situation, I'm just going to have to tell Toffee to stop doing that. Toffee.
That's the dog. The very annoying dog. We love her, but she's very annoying.
Go away. Sorry. I think where that becomes complicated and where it becomes really, really toxic is where one person in any given situation where that sort of tone or negative talking creeps in feels, for whatever reason, that they're right on that occasion to be talking like that. So therefore, there's always what I call, and I use it a lot in our rows, which is there's always mitigating circumstances to justify it in some situations, but it feels like the mitigating circumstances pretty much only ever fall one way for the person. And I'd say that that's something between us that, I can talk negatively and you pull me up on it. I don't like being pulled up on it if I'm a bit sort of not this or I'm a bit that, but I will listen and I will hear. And you will sometimes, but there'll be times in a row where neither one of us will accept that that's actually the situation. And I think that's when it becomes really, really difficult. And I wish there was some way sometimes that before it kind of quite quickly escalates into more than just negative communication, it goes to fucking DEFCON 5 within seconds. We had some, and that's why I think couples counselling would be good, we had some kind of levy that would sort of dam the flow, in some way at some point, because it sometimes related to the most slightest comment, but because it's built up in you, say, you'll suddenly go off like shit off a shovel about something, and it's just like, whoa. And then after the event, you'll explain the build-up, and that makes sense. And it's like, well, why can't we just calmly fucking say that?
Yeah, and that's what, one of these tips, why this is number one in there. Of course, communication is everything in a relationship. It doesn't matter what relationship you've got, whether that's with your parents, your children, whatever. And when that starts to break down, then your marriage is in danger. And of course, for people listening, it can go the other way, can't it? Where people, and it says this here on this site that I'm looking at, where it becomes non-verbal.
Yeah.
Where the person just completely shuts down and doesn't speak.
Yeah.
And so it's very clear on here that is really a time when couples counselling can really, really help.
But I think both of us get to those points.
Yeah.
You say you want me to be honest, but I can't be honest, and you close down. There are times when I just think she ain't gonna listen to a fucking thing I say, and I shut down. And so there are moments where one does go to separate corners of the house, and you feel very fed up, you feel very unheard, you feel, and then
I feel that, I feel it's a total sense of hopelessness. Yeah. It's utter darkness, because when you've got to the point where you just think this is going to be completely misunderstood, and this is something that I think a lot of couples get into, I know exactly what he's going to say, I know exactly what she's going to say, and actually none of us ever know exactly what another person's going to say, but we sure can get into the negative patterns of going, oh God, this is going to end up this way. And so I think that's why it's people might think, well, that's not enough to go and see a counsellor for, but I think it's the root of all evil. So I would say first port of call, actually. Okay, so I want to move on to number 2, because there are 7 here, so we can't go into massive detail with each one. Number 2, second reason, when one or both partners consider having an affair, or one partner has had an affair. Now it says here, recovering from an affair is not impossible. Good news. But it does take a lot of work, and it takes commitment and willingness to forgive and move forward. There is no magic formula for recovering from an affair. But if both individuals are committed to therapy and to being honest, the marriage may be salvaged. At the very least, it may be determined that it is healthier for both individuals to move on. And actually, I'm thinking of a couple of friends that I have that I think that's the really good thing to listen to, that even if you are feeling that it's the end of your relationship, it's still a good idea to get counselling so that you can do it in the least toxic way possible.
Well, I do remember in a previous relationship where obviously I was responsible for that, and it was less an affair, it was more a fling. We went to counselling, and I think where that counselling could have helped would have been because this is certainly the way it was steering, was that it was trying to quite objectively analyse where the impulse had come from, and not just take a stance of punishing
on the action.
Punishing the person who's done it wrong. Now, many people can have flings or affairs and realise that they've made an enormous mistake. They've made a cataclysmic mistake that they will regret for the rest of their life, and it's very hard to return to a relationship and know that the person can or should or could forgive you, and yet you can see that they're absolutely heartbroken and it's shifted something in them for life. And that's why eventually that relationship couldn't last, because I'd essentially broken that person's heart.
But it would have been great if you could have stayed with the counselling, because then that relationship.
But we did walk away from the counselling situation too soon, and I think it wasn't a case of I think the other person involved saw it very much as sort of not sanctioning my behaviour, but trying to explain it, and in so doing was simply saying there was a logic to it. And
great shame for her, because that toxicity has just literally carried through the whole.
And that toxicity can carry through, and it did, and if I'm honest, I think the guilt and shame that I felt around that for a long time also, and taking the role of sort of, not villain, that's too strong, but the person who'd been the cuckolder, I've sort of carried that with me all my life. So certainly in my drinking life, I knew that I was always had a proclivity to flirting and destroying relationships. It was another one of the reasons for stopping drinking, was I didn't want that sort of repeated again at this point in my life. And so you sort of knew that, I think I hardwired into my sort of drinking life, and therefore my social life, the idea that matters of the heart didn't matter, and I could be brisk with them and move on quickly. Do you know what I mean? So I was always very sort of cursory. So I think it's interesting how it might not have been right, counselling then might not have saved the relationship, but it might have given us a softer landing to move on.
Oh, God, yeah. So knowing what I know from it, oh, God, yeah. But you were young, These things come to us
Early
when they're older.
20s.
It's so easy to look behind. Okay, number 3, when the couple seems to just be occupying the same space, in that I think this means...
Sat on the sofa all the time?
No, it doesn't mean that you should be doing everything together, but I think, again, it's that breakdown of communication, conversation, intimacy,
right.
No sex life, you could be in the same room night after night after night doing completely opposite things,
right.
or
Present
one person's
apart.
Upstairs on the computer, the other person's downstairs.
That's a hard one to balance, isn't it? Because at the same time, within any relationship, you're wanting to factor in, you like to have your meeting. You've talked on some of these podcasts, how you'd like your time to be able to just sit in a room and just be on your own.
Oh, but I don't think they're talking about that. It would be toxic not to have time on your own.
That's what I mean.
They're talking about when when people
everyone has pre-prescribed roles and they just kind of go through
they're
the
just
motions.
coexisting, not talking, no conversation.
Well, that's my
no
idea of
laughter.
hell. That's my idea of hell. And I mean, that's when sometimes, when we have terrible rows or things aren't going right or things are odd or weird. And I sort of think, there's a feeling in both of us sometimes in those rows that we want things to be normal. Why can't we just be normal? Why can't we be a normal partner? Why can't we be just like normal men or normal, what is normal? There is no such thing as normal. It's nonsense. And yet at the same time, it is hard to not fall into habits. I suppose it's things like, cooking and, are we talking about observing the same roles within a family dynamic?
No, I think what
within
it's
a relationship?
talking about is that this could seem to a couple, why should we go and see a counsellor? We're not fighting. We're not having affairs.
So you're on autopilot.
Yeah, we're just coexisting.
Yeah.
But we're not a shared partner. We're not lovers, we're not friends, and people might almost feel guilty about going to see, because it's all right enough. But if you're unhappy, and they are suggesting that actually, and I suppose there might be a sense of fruitlessness, like we are this now, we are brother and sister, and
I think it goes. I think the word malaise is a really good one. I think
Yeah.
the malaise can run deeper than that and is more complicated than that in some relationships I've observed. I think there's almost a vested interest in maintaining that status quo of cruising around each other in autopilot from, and observing almost the same sort of rhythm and functioning, coexisting, and and I think the reason there's a sort of vested interest in that happening is it means they don't have to go into any of what they're actually feeling, because actually they are probably feeling ignored, unromanticized, uncared for, uncherished, unlooked after, unheard. And yet the routine, and I mean emotional routine as much as physical routine, of just kind of in autopilot going around each other allows you to just forget that, because it seems functional, it's functional enough.
It's like, it's not that bad.
No.
Some people are in
I see it more as a sign of
relationships,
depression.
some people are in violent relationship. God, my husband's not having an affair, know. And so number 5, number 4 leads on quite well from that, and it's another reason to go and see a counsellor. That's what we're talking about. Is that
how to know you need marriage counselling if
Yeah.
you've leapt in halfway through?
Yeah. He says here, many times I've heard couples say, we know what's wrong, but we just don't know how to fix it.
Right.
And that is, I think, the perfect time to go
Is that
to
number
counsellor.
4?
That's number 4, which leads quite well on from
Right.
when you're just coexisting. So, okay, there's something wrong. We don't know what, but we're kind of all right,
Yeah.
We wouldn't know how to fix this anyway. We're just in our routine now.
Right.
This is it for the rest of our lives.
And are they saying that that's a problem when you're using that as a reason not to seek counselling? How does that
We're
manifest?
just saying that couples will often say, I know what the problem
Right,
is, so
right.
what's the point of me going to a
Right,
counsellor?
right.
They're not going to help me fix it.
Right.
That for a counsellor is like delicious, because they can give you coping mechanisms and give you tools to try and work your way out of it.
Right,
So
yeah.
another reason. So number 5, when one partner begins to act out on negative feelings. So even if we are able to mask these feelings for a while, they're bound to surface. Negative feelings such as resentment or disappointment can turn into hurtful, sometimes harmful behaviours. I can recall a couple where the wife was very hurt by her husband's indiscretions. Although she agreed to stay in the relationship and work things out, she became very spiteful. It's interesting this, because I think for a long time after you got sober, it was like once you'd been to rehab, it was like, oh, he's been to rehab. This is so amazing, and it was. But you'd had a month of therapy and you'd had a month of group thing, and I was kind of just left going, fuck.
Yeah.
Because of course, just before you'd got in, it had got to a terrible state.
Yeah. You were still
And
left at that point.
So I was holding so much resentment. I was in a really bad way, and I didn't know how to work it out, because I knew that it wasn't really your fault, and you've got this disease, alcoholism, and you've done everything you can, and you were never going to be able to drink again. And so I felt the most in the wrong I'd ever felt. And I did feel terrible resentment and terrible rejection of you. And yeah, I mean, that's actually when we went to a counsellor.
It was.
We went to a counsellor
Well,
then,
because the
because I
relationship-
thought,
the relationship
it's not
with-
going to last.
Yeah, well,
You'd become very jealous because I'd removed myself more from you because I was more angry with you. So that was exacerbating. The more I pulled away, the more jealous
I'd stopped
you got.
drinking, so I thought that made me less interesting.
And we know for 100%, there is absolutely no way we would still be together if we hadn't gone to that counselling.
No.
I mean, I was dead. I was just like dead. I felt dead to all of it. I was just exhausted. I think when anybody, and you were exhausted, you know, when anybody's gone through any trauma, whether it's within a relationship, whether it's finding out about an affair, you know, addiction, whatever, depression, these things are massive. These things are massive, and it can leave you, even though you love that person, just reeling and wondering whether you can take another step.
Well, I do think... Go on.
And I think at those times, reaching out, honestly, you can turn things around. If you still have the willingness, you've got to have the willingness. You really can. We were at rock bottom.
No, I remember some of the counselling sessions thinking this is not going to work out. I mean, they would end. So, I mean, that's another really salutary tale, actually.
Yeah.
Don't think that just because your counselling sessions take the most terrible turn. Cruelly. I mean, I think in one of them, Nadia stormed out, and you know, it doesn't. Well, as you can see, it doesn't necessarily mean it's over. It can potentially mean that you're making progress. It's like all great things often take a bit of pain, and the thing that I mean, it's the most common thing. If you know, as you get older, and you're certainly when you're a parent of kids, and you try and impart any pearls of wisdom, given the fact that you're a grown-up child still wondering what the fuck it's all about, is that being truly emotionally honest.
Oh, sorry, it just turned off.
Oh no.
Oh, sorry about that. We don't know what happened. Just out of the blue, my phone turned off. So we are back. Okay.
I think I was saying something along the lines of honesty, yeah. And so one of the few pearls of wisdom I have learned is that it can only pay dividends, even if in the short term it's going to cause not necessarily upset, but if you can just be as emotionally honest as possible. If you genuinely love the person that you're sitting in a room with, but you've got some uncomfortable truths you want to share about them, or they want to share about you, you need to hear them in as unflinching a way as possible, but that can still be done sensitively, bizarrely. It really can. And I think the great thing about a counsellor is that where one or other of the partners maybe struggles with the presentation of that information, the counsellor can very much get involved and sort of translate what's being said into a more sort of considerate. So, you know, I mean, so there'd be times where, for example, Nadia would be extremely angry and hurt and upset, something around jealousy that, you know, my behaviour had made her unable to access the sort of more tender and sensitive side to her. And so there would be stuff that came out which in a row or an argument without the help of a counsellor, I would just react to, and I would just see as a kind of character assassination, and then it would actually fuel the jealousy or fuel the problem in hand. Whereas what would happen is through the kind of process of translating through a counsellor, I could hear that actually at the back of that fury was something kinder. And so, but it also gave me the safety of being able to express how I honestly felt, where maybe I'd stay quiet or I would articulate it through jealousy. I'm using jealousy as an example because we have particular problems with it. But, I had a forum to explain where my jealousy was coming from and to honestly explain that it wasn't just about a negative stance on you or a not trusting you. It was about not trusting things in myself. It was about not trusting the
Funny thing is, I always knew that.
Yeah, but whether you did or not.
But there we go. When we said that this counsellor had said often the partner knows the problem but they don't know how to fix it, and that's where we'd certainly.
But sometimes it's not even about fixing it, and I think that was something that we had to learn. Sometimes it's about saying it and just being heard. And
that does fix it.
Well,
so
say in our situation, rather than you trying to fix me saying something allowed it to become more fixed, and I had a part in fixing it because I could say it. Likewise with you, what I'm saying is it's not about, we're not always about fixing each other.
Well, not fixing each other.
Fixing yourself.
Fixing the situation so that you're not just tied up in resentment and anger, because where does that lead? It never gets you to a good place. No. It only ends up getting worse. Okay, so number 6, when the only resolution appears to be separation. Okay, so when a timeout turns into an overnight stay away from home or eventually leads to a temporary separation, this may indicate a need for counselling. Spending time away from home does not usually resolve the situation. And I think That's true. How many times when you've heard somebody go, "Oh, we're having a trial separation," do you think, well,
That's over.
that's over?
Yeah,
I mean,
absolutely.
honestly, don't you?
Well, you know, it's a pretty damn short. I mean, that's about as obvious a reason to go to counselling as there is.
Actually, I don't think that would have been the case for us. I think because we were still really in love, I think if we'd separated, we would have still stayed together.
Well, there have been situations and circumstances where across a week, you know, a couple of days would, you know, time out, or a couple of I'd head over to my mum's flat or something when she was away, so I could just get away for a bit. And be away from you, because we were sort of like, you know, at each other all the time. So I do think, I mean, I've had trial separations in the past, and then you get back together and then the relationship falters.
Because
months
what's going to
afterwards.
have changed, unless you're going
Absolutely.
to have got a third party,
Yeah.
I think, involved, or you're going to have put in, you know, use some of the tools that a counsellor gives you. I mean, we have mentioned this before on the podcast, but I do want to mention it again, because it is one of the first things that counsellors get you to do. So you can try this at home if you can't yet get your other half to a counsellor, which is you set a timer and you each talk individually without the other one interrupting at all. You don't have to answer what the other person's saying. So Mark could sit and talk for 10 minutes, for instance, about how he's feeling neglected and unheard and whatever. And then I can either answer that in my 10 minutes, or I could talk about something completely different, because it's trying to just get you to listen to each other. And that's one of the biggest problems, I think, for all relationships, isn't it? Is really listening, especially over a long period of time, because you do that thing that I mentioned. We go, oh, well, I know what they're going to say here. I know what they're going to say.
You shorthand everything each
Shorthand,
other says.
yeah.
Yeah.
So it's a really good. I can't remember what they call it, but yeah,
Yeah.
it's a good technique anyway to try. So.
So do you need to split? Do you need to go to counselling? Do you need to split up? Here's the seventh and final reason.
Ooh,
What is it?
so when a couple is staying together for the sake of the children.
Wow.
Now, this counsellor that I'm reading out from, how would I say that? I'm quoting here, says doesn't really seem to think that that's a good idea, to stay for the sake of the children. Children know. They always
Well, children
know.
always know when something's going
So
wrong.
if you are in your head saying, I am desperately unhappy, we are unhappy as a couple, but we are staying together for the children, this is a big red flashing sign that what you might actually be doing is making everybody unhappy, and really a counsellor could really help with this.
What you need to watch out for in this situation as well is that the children, I think too many families, especially in this country, think that we're far more effective at hiding things than we are. And I think everyone falls foul of it, because sometimes it's not practical, is it, to constantly sort of, you know, engage with whatever it is you're feeling, so you push on. The whole stiff upper lip thing, which is what, you know, for example, if I think back to my nan and granddad's relationship, in retrospect, he was an incredibly moody man, and great swathes of my safe childhood at my grandparents were dictated by the very gloomy mood of my grandfather. And I could also see how my nan was deeply, deeply irritating
And probably
and
unhappy.
controlling and unhappy. So, you know, and they for me were the sort of, you know, the manifestation of a supposedly secure and stable family. And I could see within that, you know, what I'm trying to say is every child knows on some level when things aren't going well.
Well, that's what he says
And
here.
worse than that, many children, when they know, depending on how bad it's got, will start to internalise it and say
blame
it's their
themselves.
responsibility.
Yeah.
And that's why it isn't always sensible to stay together for the kids.
Well, he says here it's almost impossible to fake happiness to a child. They're
Totally.
intuitive, they're intelligent,
Yeah.
they pick it up. That he would have children say, you know, I know my parents don't really like each other. They're nice to each other, but they never smile or laugh like my friend's parents. So they do know.
Yeah.
I mean, God, our kids pull us up on everything. I think our kids know more about us than we do.
But, you know,
We don't get away with a thing.
And I do think sometimes, especially as your kids get older, they know when, I mean, the most difficult thing is having awareness of one's own atmosphere one brings into a room. And because I'm a depressive and an alcoholic, I've had it often told to me when I'm doing that. And even if I don't agree with it, I will eventually come round to it. But I do think our children certainly as they get older, they know when the adults are bringing an atmosphere into the room. So you might not, for example, think that you're being stressy. You just think you're being motivated or whatever. But you are. There is.
See the way he's getting his.
No. But what I'm saying is,
I know when I'm stressed.
But you don't. Here's the thing: you don't always know what mood you're in or what atmosphere comes in with you.
Nobody always knows.
But sometimes I think you can. If you're in a loving family, and sometimes I do. Sometimes it gets frustrating that if you are genuinely in love with each other, you have no vested interest in bashing the other person, which is why one tries not to be vindictive in rows and things like that, because actually I do love this person. I might not get it right all the time, but the last thing I'm willing to... Can we not just have it as a given that we're all on the same page with loving each other and supporting each other?
Well, I mean, that's like rose-tinted glasses, isn't it? Of course, every relationship would work if people could just say, oh my God, I know that it just doesn't work like that. People are bringing in their own insecurities, their own fallibilities, their own worries, their own fears, and that all gets in the way of just going, oh my God, I know that you love me, and everything you say comes from a place of love. That's
I know. I suppose what I'm saying in that example is that there is always the potentiality of me being depressed or down, so it can always be attached to my mood, for example. Whereas what I'm saying is, for very valid reasons, you can come into the house and be in a certain state or a certain place. You will be positioning it as something meaningful and constructive in your head, but to those around you, it's bloody annoying. And if the thing about children is, children can very often be... They can pick that up in you before you even know it yourself. So,
well, and I think children will go to each individual parent, like the kids come to me and they say, God, what's wrong with Dad?
Yeah.
And they'll say to you, God, what's wrong with Mum? And, I think that's the same for every couple. But I think the important thing is that if you're able to let your children see that you make up also, that part of a relationship is arguing, is being irritable with each other, but the important thing for a child is that they get closure. It's really hard for them if they don't see any closure. I will sometimes say to the girls, yes, Daddy annoys me to hell, oh my God, yes, Daddy can be really irritating, but I love him, and he's also wonderful, and he's also this and he's that. And then that's teaching them that we all are. We're all made up of many different things. Nobody is wonderful all the time. Nobody is calm all the time. We're all just trying to get through the day at the end of the day, aren't we? And I think if children see you accepting that in your partner, it lets them accept it in themselves as well. Nobody's perfect.
And I think a really important thing to stress is that if your relationship is, suffering from any one of these 7 things and you're in that position, is to not use your children as the counsellor. I think a lot of relationships can end up using the children as almost the means of communication, also the way of kind of tapping in this classic, what sort of mood's your mum in, what sort of mood's your dad in, that sort of, so the child is feeling the pressure of reading their parents' emotions, toxic. It's really toxic. Yeah. And that happens beyond, even when you've split up, certainly with separated children, separated household with my eldest, I know I would wrongly ask how her mum was through her, and, and it would put unnecessary pressure. On the children. So there you go.
Wow, that is a lot of stuff we discussed there. I'm rather proud.
I've just had a great idea for another podcast, which is all about bombing relationships, emotional bombs. Because it's really, for me, I remember it being a big part of our couples counselling was how it was the language we were using at the time. But we should maybe do a whole podcast on emotional bombing. Yeah. Because it's a phrase where in different ways, each partner will find a way of sabotaging the situation in some way.
Oh, God, that was exhausting. I'm not kidding, guys. That was totally exhausting. Please, if you didn't subscribe at the beginning, subscribe to our YouTube channel and swap over. Maybe listen to it on a podcast. Podcast people maybe watch it on YouTube. And sorry about the little break there. That doesn't usually happen. Bye.
Bye.